Morning. I'm impressed. So many people are excited about governance. Cool. It's funny. Governance means so many things to so many different people. It's hard to kind of do the subject well. My name is David Johnson. I'm Principal Program Manager Architect, responsible for a Microsoft tenant. So how do we manage change? How do we manage all the things employees build and create? How do we decide where tenant configurations is across this vast data estate? How do we manage and protect ourselves? How do we stay legally compliant everywhere we operate? I mean, these are complex topics a tenant has to deal with. And so I'll talk about these things. And of course, especially now that we have additional ways of discovery and information being surfaced, governance is more important now than it was ever before. Because I think both the security landscape has evolved, the threat landscape has become more complex, the exposures to how employees are seeing things is getting more obviously prevalent. Copilot will show you everything employee can see, which is fantastic, but it also means Copilot can show you everything the employee can see, which means you need to govern. So we want to make sure we've got the right tools in place. Tuesday, I talked a lot about the focus on Copilot, and I went into a lot of detail there. I'll just touch on a couple of those topics here, but I'm going to focus more on other aspects of tenant governance today. But I'll touch on, for those who weren't on Tuesday, a little bit about some of the pieces of asset governance as well. So what I'm going to talk about is really fundamentally what we govern from a Microsoft tenancy perspective. And so the Microsoft tenant is obviously a rather large customer of ourselves. We're also a complex customer in that we're the first customer in many ways. We get the bits before anybody else, which puts us in an interesting, unique position. But at the same time, it's a great position and it's a privileged position, but it's also challenged. So I'll talk about what we govern, what that looks like. Managing change for us looks a little different than everybody else, but there's still a lot of goodness from what we do that hopefully everyone else can learn from as well. How we think about self-service. I believe asset management is a fundamental. We want our employees to be successful. I'll talk about that. Asset governance. For me, labeling is a big thing. I'll talk about that. Meeting policies. One of the things that I've talked about with a lot of people and a lot of customers seem nervous about meeting recordings, which is interesting because we find that meeting recordings is so critical now and changes the game. I'll talk about how we got to a point with legal and privacy and every regulatory and workers' councils, the meeting recording conversation, because I think that's an important one to figure out what are the aspects of that. And I'll also touch on app management, because obviously now we have all these different types of apps managing against the tenant, line of business, third party, obviously tenant change, all that stuff it's got to deal with. How do you manage all this stuff that's touching your data estate? So I'll touch on that too. So a lot here. But as I said, I'm going to focus on the things on basically these main areas. So really quickly, jumbo tenant as Microsoft. These numbers aren't exact. They change all the time. But fundamentally, we're a rather big customer. One of the things that I'll call out, people often ask me, well, you have a lot of guests. And it's like, yes, we do have a lot of guests. And why is that? Because I would far rather the Microsoft employee invite the guest in to a team on my tenant than share a file via some external service off tenant. I'd rather them share a file from SharePoint versus putting it on some other service, or worse yet, emailing it around, and never know what it's going to be. If it's on my tenant, I can audit it. I know who did it. I know I can revoke access. I have everything I need to do. I can protect it appropriately. I can determine who has access to what. I can do all those things as long as it's on my tenant. As soon as it leaves the tenant, I lose all visibility. I'd rather not do that. Therefore, we allow guests in our tenant. We manage them carefully, and we've got good policies around when guests can get in. But that's one of the big aspects of what we do is we manage ourselves and we allow guests in. That's why our numbers are so big. The other aspect of why the numbers are so big is we allow self-service team creation. Any employee in the company can create a team or a SharePoint site. Well, why? Well, fundamentally, I'd rather them, again, create a new SharePoint site, a new team, as opposed to overloading an existing one. I mean, how many times have we seen, and certainly I have, when some HR department overloads some site with another folder in it which is more open than the other because, well, another project's going in there, and then someone else drops content in there not realizing they just overexposed it. I mean, that happens far too frequently. We have to catch it, but that's one of the reasons why we evangelize, look, go create a new site. Don't reuse an existing if it's for a different purpose, for a different roster. Go create net new. So a lot of sites, a lot of teams, a lot of things across the board that we manage. Obviously, we're heavily loaded. By the way, we're also a multi-tenant organization in that we've got a tenant, a region in Europe as well as Asia, because of course I've got to be regulatory compliant everywhere, which means I've got to have a presence in Europe, I've got to have on-prem data in Europe, or not on-prem, but cloud data region in Europe. So I worry about a lot, and I think from a tenant perspective, I'm not sure it's just me, but these are things I worry about, right? Of everything from all the things that are coming, what's going to break me? What's going to potentially put me at risk? Is this new thing going to expose data that wasn't exposed before? Whatever configuration, what's optimal? Now, Microsoft does a great job, Microsoft being the service provider in this case, of trying to get the defaults right and secure by default. At the same time, as a tenant, sometimes you want to evaluate, is this okay for me? Are the defaults that Microsoft is pushing out going to be okay for me as a tenant? And yes, even Microsoft as a customer of Microsoft has to answer these questions. In fact, in some cases, it comes back to, we're rather harsh critic of ourselves, to be honest. And we ask these questions around, are the defaults right? And am I going to potentially overexpose? I have to think about that regulatory compliance I mentioned earlier, but I've got effectively, and I'm not sure how many of you are multinationals with workers' councils, but that's something for us, it's a big deal too. Am I going to have any employee pushback? Or is there going to be fear that the company's spying on the employee effectively, and new ways for that to happen? And are those fears going to basically bubble up to some sort of escalation because workers' councils can effectively do that? So I worry about all those things. I worry about sprawl. I mean, how many customers don't worry about sprawl? Like if you allow self-service, you want to make sure you have some way of managing all this data state. How do I make sure things are appropriately permissioned and managed? Like these are all themes that I worry about. I worry about the app data state. Do I really trust this third party? Did this developer, maybe they hired someone who knew to build something that was not properly secured, and they build an app, they deploy it to the tenant, or try to deploy it to the tenant, and now I'm left, okay, am I okay with that? Is that app allowed to touch sensitive data? Touching SharePoint and Teams and email, those are sensitive things. I want to make sure that the app is okay before that happened. So those are all things I worry about. So I have processes in place on all three of these things, and I'll go into more detail on each. But everything from how we ingest message center, data from what's coming and how do we manage the change, to how to manage asset governance and all the things that exist, to how do I understand the app ecosystem, how do I do a third-party apps, how do I do line of business apps. All those things need to happen for me to be comfortable and protect myself. So that's kind of just a lay of the land as I go, and I'll go into more detail on each of these. One aspect I think is really important on governance, though, and when you're thinking about the tenant, it's funny when you talk to people about this, that there's a disconnect between legal and security and IT, and IT has to be in the middle of all these things. But what I find is, in order for me to govern really successfully, I want that buy-in. I want to make it legal, and IT and security are all partnering on what is the right thing to do. So one of the things I've done is I've got a governance committee effectively saying, look, we're going to manage the tenant. I've got my lawyers who are partnering with us on point, who are helping us get it right in some cases. I've got my security partners who are evaluating what are the right configurations, as well as, of course, IT administration, what are the change impact, how do we actually manage this thing. But a part of a challenge for us is, in a complex enterprise, you have businesses like Xbox and LinkedIn and Azure, and different orgs have different desires, they have different expectations, different cultures. How do we support each? Employees just want IT out of the way, right? They just want to get their job done. And how do they do it as seamlessly as possible? And those are all things I have to worry about to make it work. So when I govern the tenant, I find that the best way for me to do that is to make sure I'm not doing something and then my partner scream later or waiting for them to come up with an answer. The way I do it is I basically say, as Microsoft IT, Microsoft Digital is, by the way, I should have said this earlier, the Microsoft IT organization, and as Microsoft IT, we are wholly accountable for the tenant of Microsoft and our data estate. Like you're a customer, you manage all your stuff and your services. We manage our stuff and our services. The service provider, Microsoft, of the 365 product is effectively firewalled from us. They don't touch our tenant. They're just like anyone else, any other customer tenant. So we manage ourselves, we make our decisions. But at the end of the day, I have to balance those legal decisions with the security decisions, which is why we bring them together to have a conversation. We come up with a decision, we go. And that's generally how we think about managing and how we bring these pieces together. Because again, legally, I've got to deal with e-discovery and retention and legal hold, all these things. So there's a new tech, support that. Am I going to be okay? What are the implications of this? What are the HR implications of this in some cases? All things that we think about. So really briefly on configuration and change though, and there's at the bottom of the slide basically a couple papers. One, how we did the change management, and two, how the Microsoft Learn doc about how to deal with change management appropriately. And I think there's two ways I think about this. Proactive change and reactive change. Obviously as IT, you want to be in the proactive seat. You want to know what's coming. The best way to do that is obviously understanding roadmaps, conferences like this, understanding what's coming from Microsoft. We pay close attention to what's happening for obvious reasons. I'm sure you do too, that's why you're here. And we want to make sure we can basically evaluate as early as possible what are the implications of a change, how can we deal with that, what are the right things to do, how is this going to fit with the rest of the data estate? Like those are things we have to think about. And I try to push as much upstream from a proactive perspective as possible. I'm in a unique position as a customer of ourselves, in that not only do I have roadmap and the message center, but I also have, I have sometimes products I want to get something into effectively almost a dog food ring. They want to try something out, and then it's a conversation, and let's evaluate it, let's get a plan. So I've got the proactive change where I have to determine what am I going to do, what's coming roadmap-wise, what's my plan, but I also, quite frankly, have to be reactive. Sometimes Message Center, you get something and you get a surprise. Hopefully the surprise is quick enough and you can turn it around and figure it out, but sometimes it's a little tight. Either way, Message Center is the reactive side. Everything that comes through Message Center gets funneled into Planner for us. So one of the things we do is our Exchange admins, our Teams admins, our SharePoint OneDrive admins, they triage. Message Center posts come in, they get funneled into silos to basically say, let's evaluate this. Does it really impact us or not? And then if it does, we're going to do a deeper dive on that thing of do we need to actually take it through governance to make a decision about it, or is it basically okay as is? Quite frankly, 95% of the things coming through Message Center don't care. It's like, yep, not going to really impact me in any negative way. I'm going to be fine. 5%, roughly, that's the stuff that's like, yeah, now I need to think about this. What are the implications of this? So what do I need to configure the tenant to be? Those are all things that I need to do. But I think for me, a best practice is making sure, and I know we message this broadly too, is funnel all the Message Center things into something where you can triage them. It's kind of hard to just evaluate these giant lists. In many cases, you want to sometimes funnel them to people who are experts in their field. You want the Teams enterprise voice people to evaluate enterprise voice impacting messages, right? So funneling them around and making sure we can centrally see, have we triaged them successfully? Do we have any open things going on? We can know what's effectively happening with a tenant, or what's going to happen with a tenant, and are we going to be okay? And we can make a holistic decision about it. So that was about the change management. Probably a lot more, but it's a huge topic by itself. As I said, a couple papers available there. But best practice, funnel things into Planner, triage appropriately. Asset governance. Obviously, all these things that employees create, what do you do with them? And how do we manage? I mean, first, I think about, let's talk about files. Files, for me, are one of the biggest assets that is high risk, right? Files leave, they have sensitive information. They're the lifeblood of a lot of a company. Outside of your, at least in our case, the code, which is, and sometimes the data that's in CRMs, files are a massive risk for the company. We have to protect them appropriately. In my case, some other sessions, like the last one here, in fact, talked about OneDrive. We have known folder mapping. We push sync out on all corporate-owned devices across the company. I do not want a corporate-owned device that has files locally only on the device. That is a risk for the company, ransomware potential, like no recovery. I want everything in cloud. So all the documents folders, we automatically silently push known folder mapping. We set it all up. Employees are going to have a documents folder mapped to the cloud. But that's for the employees' documents. And this is where things get a little challenging sometimes. I want employees' documents to be the things that are for the employee, because clearly when that employee leaves, those documents are going with them. We delete the OneDrive. It's tied to the life cycle of the employee. When they leave the company, that OneDrive's gone. That, the manager gets it for like 30 days to potentially pull stuff off, but realistically, managers aren't going to sift through a OneDrive. So it's almost all the time the data is just going to go away after the employee leaves the company. SharePoint is really where, by backing the team, is really where we want that shared information, the project stuff. And of course, it's always interesting to make sure we educate our employees as to this is where you put things, here's how you get your roster right, here's how you manage SharePoint. But at the end of the day, that's how we're pushing team collateral, and we want people to be able to create things and put files in the right place. So for us, when I think about part of the asset management, it's that side of things. But assets go far beyond that. I manage everything from obviously teams and Outlook groups, and in fact, I manage SG security groups now. So we manage a lot of stuff from a tenant standpoint, and obviously there's a lot of complexity there. But I think one of the key themes here is, one, my goal is to empower our employees. I mean, obviously as a company, we're about empowerment, right? So as IT, we're of course following that model of we want to empower our employees to be successful, but with guardrails. And that, I say there's a but there, because I'm not just going to let an employee run wild. I'm going to govern the data estate. I'm going to have strong lifecycle management on the data estate. And I'll talk about that in a minute. But I do all this not just for, obviously, sites and groups and those kind of key things, but I also do this on Power Platform environments, for example, now. We're doing work now to do it for Power BI workspaces, because at the end of the day, all these things that get created, I don't want to have to keep them if nobody needs them. I want to make sure I've got an accountable owner for everything that exists. And I'll talk about that in a little bit as we go. But, and the other part of this is using Microsoft Information Protection becomes really important. So as I think about this, so I mentioned the self-service aspect of this. Everyone can create, but to be fair, not everyone. You have to be a full-time employee. So there's literally a security group backed in Intra ID that says who's allowed to create groups. That's defined with only full-time employees in my company. They're the ones who can do that. And I think a good way to think about this is, I would like that group to be used for my more workloads, but point is, I can configure who can create things. Those are the set of people I'm going to hold accountable to having created things. And everything that gets created has lifecycle management behind it. If it gets created, it must have a need to exist. It's either me going to own it as IT centrally, which we're not going to own much. Legal's going to own it because it's some sort of record or something's under retention, or the employee is going to own it. So we'd rather the employee own it. The other aspect of this is I want to make sure that I can identify valuable content, but clearly I want to do data delineation. It's really hard in an enterprise as IT to go, where do I have risks? This site here is wide open. Should it be? Is that okay? This other site here is wide open. Well, this one might be on purpose. This one might be accidental. This one might be a really sensitive project site. This one may be fair, right? How do you know? So for me, labeling is a way for me as IT to be able to basically understand my data estate a little bit so that I can at least put some framing in point on top of it, and I can do additional protection. I'll talk about that in a minute. With a trust but verify model on top of it. And obviously all these things get protected. So in my world, all the assets, of course, I have information protections across the board, obviously multi-factor authentication, conditional access. Our admins are all running on secure access workstations with an alt account. You literally do not, our admins do not even have an account on the corporate domain directly. That account is actually coming from another security domain, another tenant effectively, that is completely isolated and independent, and that their primary identity is never used to elevate to be a, for example, global admin or SharePoint admin. We want to do that segregation of duties completely. That way, if something does happen, there's no way to actually get through to the next layer. That way, if for whatever reason, your primary corporate identity, let's say you're a SharePoint admin, for whatever reason, they get phished, right? I just do not want that identity to have any potential to get elevating in, right? In our case, there's no way for that to happen. It literally isn't the tenant admin identity. It is an alternate identity that's going to manage our data estate and to be able to get into these services. And lastly, I'm ensuring accountability and all these things. Like, of course, everything that's on the service has to be audited. In fact, that's one of the things I look for when a new application comes through. Does it write properly to the unified audit log? If it does, good. If it doesn't, I've got a problem. Everything, every change, everything an employee does, I have to hold them accountable. So we make sure that we also, of course, have lifecycle management, as I mentioned earlier. Everything has to be attested. And if you're inviting guests in, you invite joecontoso.com as a member of your team because they're in the project, because we've got a project with some chip manufacturer, or you share a file with some standards body. Great, totally fair game, but you're going to have to reattest and re-up that renewal of that guest, otherwise they're gone. And that's kind of a point on all this stuff. So a lot of that's protection is tied back to labels. And I talked about labels in more detail on Tuesday, so I won't go too much here other than to say this goes back to the fundamental framing and also keeping it really simple. I think the lessons we learned, it's got to be simple and got to be employee understandable. Otherwise, it's kind of meaningless. At the end of the day, labels are really just as much about culture. It is about the technology. A label can apply a policy. Yes, and you can make sure that some things happen, like no guests allowed, or you can encrypt this thing to full-time employees only, for example. Great, you can do those things. But if an employee sees something and talks about it in the wrong place, that's a problem. The culture means a lot to the label schema, which is why for me, visibility of labels, making labels simple, understandable, clear gets really important. Highly confidential for us is that need to know data. Do not share even with broad security groups. It's not meant to be. It's meant to be deeply protected stuff with strong lifecycle management on roster. So I won't go too much about the label in more detail, but a couple quick things. Every SharePoint site, every group in my company has to be labeled, everything, no matter what. And so I think at any given time, I'm roughly 99.9% labeled across all the SharePoint, because you always have something that comes up and spin up behind the scenes. We flag it, we take care of it, but point is, everything gets labeled. Information protection, Purview can collect the labels, we can manage that. But one of the other parts of this is not only am I doing the kind of standard policies on labels, everything from the site can have guests or not, the site's allowed sharing or not with guests or not, is the group public or private? Yeah, those things are all absolutely, this is what that table shows. But the other big thing that I'm doing is default library labels. And for me, this is an important story, because how many employees think about labeling a document? You think about the project maybe. You think, yeah, this is a sensitive project, but is every file going to really get that level of interrogation from every employee? Not really. And so it becomes really important. What I've learned is that I want all SharePoint sites not just to have a container label, a site label, a group label, but also to have a default library label for SharePoint to write, which SharePoint now does, to say if the site, for example, is highly confidential, Microsoft internal only, that means that file label is going to be highly confidential, MS extended, or in the case of our default, confidential internal only means the file label default is confidential MS extended. Effectively, both mean the same. One's a file label with rights protection, the other's a container label, but point is, one maps to the other cleanly, and they effectively mean the same thing in many ways. They basically mean tenant only. And so one locks to the other, and people don't have to think about it. You put a new document in that library, it gets automatically set the label unless it was previously labeled. You edit an existing document, it gets set that label unless it was already previously labeled purposely. So again, that for me is really important. And I talk about the labeling front so much is because, especially now with more discovery scenarios coming up, your data is going to get shown in more places. And I want to make sure that that data is being shown the right way to the right people. One of the things that Copilot does quite well is it will show the label of the highest source for the content. It's like, I gave you an analogy. In fact, when we're talking about Copilot, and I learned about what they're going to do, I used like an apple pie scenario. I said, well, look, if some of the apples in the apple pie are poisonous, don't you want to tell the person who's about to eat the apple pie that maybe the apple pie is poisonous, right? And so Copilot did that. That's exactly what they have. So when Copilot sees a poison apple or something that's labeled as poison apple, it'll show that label on the result. By the way, this result contains poison apples. And so that's the whole beauty of this. And so that's why for me, again, another best practice, label files. And it's really hard to do unless you think about defaults. If you get your defaults right, you're in much better shape than just using DLP and auto labeling. DLP and auto labeling are great, really valuable for that high critical stuff of passwords, the credit card numbers, the things that you know as pattern, you know you're going to find, the known patterns. But like in my case, I have projects. And sometimes it's just a common name, and the common name will get reused again and again. But how is Purview and DLP supposed to know that this common name refers to, well, the common name, this other one refers to this tented project that was it was opened up a year ago, this other one is tented today, because we reuse common names. So reality is that employees really need to label themselves, the content, and that way I can determine what matters and drive that change appropriately. Employees can, of course, change the file label themselves, and we have all the standard labels that exist. But again, the 99% cases, label your stuff, manage to that, do a trust but verify. The good thing here is, of course, that other things now take advantage of the labels. Loop now gets labeled, so Loop components. So you get one more thing, more is coming. It's actually, the reason I'm betting on this so much is because, again, as an IT, we're trying to empower our employees. I need to understand the data state. And I know a lot of people said labels is talked about a lot this conference, but it's there for a reason, because for me it is a really big deal to help understand it. But there's a lot, but also, again, I want to enforce policy. Labels is one part of that policy. So everything must be labeled. Every site, every container must be labeled. But another aspect of this is I want to have that strong lifecycle management. I want to have a creation. I mentioned earlier, only full-time employees can create groups, defined in Entra. I have naming rules in Entra that effectively no bad words, like the standard, the naughty word list as we call it, right? The standard things that basically say, make it organized effectively. What I don't do, by the way, with naming rules, and some people ask me this, do I use prefixes or suffixes? And I don't, because one of the things we basically said is, yes, I could say this is, for example, LinkedIn underscore or ally underscore. If it was a LinkedIn site, I choose not to do that because we basically realized employees in the experience, they start to gloss over that. It just overwhelms. So we don't prefix anything. Naming rules supports all that if you want to, but we don't do that. But the other aspect of this is we are managing all these things in the core services here. So yeah, but the thing about this is creating a chain of accountability of everything that exists. So in my world, the products actually do a really good job of inactive, right? So Entra has this great inactive group policy. You can enforce basically groups be renewed, and if it's not active, it gets you have to deal something with it. So you can do that. SharePoint has this great inactive sites policy now in SharePoint Premium, in part of the secure access management. So great, a lot of things you can do to do this. I go one step further. I go custom for today. My expectation is I'm not going to be custom for long. I've heard from a little birdie that I'm going to get that fixed. SharePoint Premium is marching on this journey, but point is, my expectation is today, well, in the future, I will get SharePoint Premium to cover me. Today, what I'm doing is effectively I'm driving attestation. I take the same exact model that Groups does, and I kind of scale it out to say, I don't care if you're active or not, you're going to test this thing, and I'm going to make you validate that you have membership is right, your owners are right, your label is right, and if you don't attest, I delete. And to be clear, that's a strong statement as an IT organization to say, I'm going to delete stuff. But one of the things we've learned in my agreement with legal is that I'm not going to have retention policies on 99% of a data estate. I've got retention on clear things that have to be, your HR documents, your contracts, the things that really must be under clear retention. That's under retention. But everything else, I want lifecycle management for. I want to clean it out. So I have to have attestation because I have to have some clear accountability for everything that exists along these things. Reporting, one aspect of this is that I want to understand my data estate. And that's really important, at least for me, when I've got this much stuff. Because I'm empowering my employees, I need to know where oversharing exists. And I talked a little bit more detail on this one Tuesday, but and so there's in the deck on that slide that you can see. The point is, everything for me today is exported in Graph Data Connect of a group, every site, every file, every link. I can tell security where does joecontoso.com have access on my tenant, whether it was through sharing because they're a member of a group or a member of a shared channel shared to another tenant with a team on another tenant. They're a member of a group on that tenant. I know exactly where that person has access to my tenant because I export the entire everything that exists ACL-wise because I want that. Therefore, what I can do with that is now tell me, I can answer questions like, where do I have a highly confidential site that has a large security group on it, has more than 5,000 members on it? I can tell that. Now, the nice thing is, I do this today with Graph Data Connect, which SharePoint totally supports. It's all exportable, works great. Bring it all to my data lake, you get all the reports I want. SharePoint Premium starting with this journey with lots of reports today. More is coming. This is actually really, to me, an important thing because as a company, understanding your data estate is a really important thing. I'm thrilled that SharePoint Premium is on this journey too because it's going to help everybody get this right in a far more simple way. Because today, of course, getting it out in your data lake means you need a data team, managing it all, doing all the joins, basically a giant extract. Effectively, our data estate translates into roughly 10 billion records, 10 rows, I mean, with everything we've got. So we've got a huge inventory of all this stuff that we kind of manage. One thing we do here is I manage membership for groups. One aspect of this is that obviously, most cases, a group is just create a group, let people manage it themselves. It's ad hoc. It's whoever the owner wants to add. And that's fine for certain purposes. But we find that obviously secret projects or an organizational group or let's say all full-time employees under this CVP, like how do you do that? Well, dynamic groups can handle some of that. Dynamic groups does a great job of saying if you're under this manager or have this property in Entra, it'll do that. It'll do a great job of it. What we do beyond that, though, is we say, I want to do for all types of groups. So, and this tool, by the way, is available. So We actually provide this one on GitHub, which I've got a link here for this, that this tool is available for anyone to use to basically say, I'm going to basically extract some data from my HR system, so I can literally build a group to say, who's a full-time employee with this level and above under this leader. And we can do that. And of course, we're getting all the data from HR because, for example, level isn't something we put in intra, at least not today. And so we can therefore manage that membership dynamically for every group we've got, which becomes really important for us for all the core new things for Viva Amplify, Viva Connections, Viva Engage. Like, one of the first reasons I realized I needed to have these groups like this is we said, well, I need to have a live broadcast for the CVP, but only full-time employees in his org. And I said, well, how do I do that with Entra? Oh, you can't. Okay, how do I manage membership now? A giant Excel import? No, we're not going to do that. So again, that's why we built this group membership management tool to deal with Viva Engage and Amplify and all the other things, and now securing things for everything, including Copilot, that I want to manage my data state. So we're using group membership management in a lot of places. We have many groups, far more than dynamic groups today, managed this way. And we hope over time dynamic groups and Entra will get better and better. We're partnering with them. My expectation is it will. Right now, though, we're using an independent tool, which is why we're sharing it, because we believe so strongly this is one of those examples of things that matter, getting the group membership right. And that helps, again, with many of these scenarios that we've got around this. One other thing in this kind of whirlwind tour of governance, and I apologize, there's so many aspects to this, but when you think about the data state, there's just a lot of key things. And I wanted to talk about meetings because a lot of subjects come up about meetings, and it stokes a lot of fear because legal says, well, but what if we get sued if this thing's recorded and someone finds it? It's now a discoverable thing. And in IT will say, but all that storage is just gonna kill me. Like, I don't know how many of you had recordings turned on with Stream back when it was in classic Stream. For me, I flooded Stream. Like, it was bad. I had a lot of data in Stream, which we quite frankly couldn't manage properly because Stream, well, it wasn't great. Now, fortunately, that's retired. Everything's now on SharePoint. I can manage it. So, but again, like lifecycle management, I mean, the storage becomes a fear. So all these things, like there's key things that I think about here, and I'll talk about this a little bit because I think this is actually really important to this conversation. Like first, the transcript. Employees and legal get like nervous, especially when I'm dealing with European workers' councils. Privacy is a big deal, and of course we respect it. And nice thing about transcription is an employee can opt out of transcript. Do people know that? How many people talk about that, right? But point is, you can opt out of transcript attribution, meaning it'll say speaker one said, not your name. And that's you may not want to allow that. You may want to hold the employee accountable. And by the way, that's not foolproof because obviously it's a voice call, you're going to know by voice potentially who said it. But point is, the transcript will at least not acknowledge who said it. So again, that's one of the big key themes. The other aspect of this is notice that we want to make sure that employees are aware that they're being recorded. And by the way, that there's effectively an announcement. And so some of this is done by training. We train our employees, by the way, before you click that record button, ask the question, am I okay to record? And by the way, we have legal guidance that says when not to record. Not all meetings should be recorded. Maybe an attorney-client call, a privilege call, for example, maybe that shouldn't be a recorded call. So great, but we have guidance clear that's there for that. Plus, we use, and I'll talk about it in a minute, meeting labels to gate when and who can record meetings. Because again, I want to make sure that I can deal with that. And yes, I label meetings. That's a relatively new thing. I label documents, I label email, I label sites, I label groups. Now I label meetings, and more is coming. So yeah, I label the meetings that I have across the tenant. Only meeting organizers can download the recording, right? It used to be the recorder could download the meeting too. And that was always a problem, which is one of the reasons why some labels say only the organizer can record. Now, with the new what's rolling out, only the organizer will be able to record, or sort of will be able to have it in their OneDrive, which means that changes the game a little bit because it means only the organizer can record no matter what. SharePoint, one of the things we said is that retention, I mentioned earlier, bloat with storage, right? And that's a big deal. Bloat of storage is not a small problem. I blew my stream storage quota significantly a couple times. We kept having to deal with it. So one of the nice things with SharePoint OneDrive is turn on that expiration policy. And this, again, is another best practice, that when meeting recordings happen, make sure that policy's there, set it to what's reasonable. Just talk about it with your legal team, your security team, decide what the right policy is. But every meeting, therefore, by default, will delete, recording will delete 90 days after. Now, I say expiration versus retention for a really important reason, because expiration is something that's changeable. It's not, like retention is a hard date. If I say there's a retention policy that says this file is going to get deleted in 60 days, there's no user choice. It's done. It's gone. With expiration, there's user choice. The employee can go in and say, I want to keep this video not 90 days. I want to keep it 6 months. And that might be okay. And in our case, that is okay. We allow for that. But first of all, not even like 2% of employees actually will change the expiration date. Most will just let it expire out. Because really what we see with meeting recordings, the vast majority of the value is less than 1 week after a meeting. Right? You missed a meeting, you want to catch up, you want to learn from what happened, you want to do a recap, you want to see what happened. Great. Your curve is going to typically die off pretty quickly after a week or two. So it's one of the reasons why for us, the meeting recordings can be totally deleted within 90 days, after 90 days. And by the way, that also will delete the transcript. It's in SharePoint or OneDrive. So those are all things, again, we do on that. So meeting labels. One aspect of this is that every meeting now gets labeled in the company. And now, to be clear, I just rolled this out like not even 6 months ago. So this is all new. We're still learning ourselves to get this right. Team meeting policies for labeling is, again, expanding. More's coming. We're going to take advantage of some of these additional capabilities. Like today, I could do things like say, who can record? Well, only the organizer can record in certain meetings. Who can join the lobby? The lobby, because to me, because there's no rights protection on a meeting, the lobby is your kind of barrier as to who can join automatically versus have to be gated by someone admitting them. So one of the things we do is we gate that lobby policy. And that lobby policy is tied to the label. So if it's a general meeting, or if it's, I should say if it's a public meeting or a non-business meeting, I don't care. There's no lobby. It's wide open. If it's a confidential meeting, that lobby is going to get locked to tenant members only, who are going to be able to bypass the lobby. Anyone who's outside of tenant is going to have to wait in the lobby to get admitted. If it's a recipients only meeting, like highly confidential, for example, or confidential, it means that now that lobby is literally that, first of all, meeting invite is not forwardable. It marks the mail as do not forward, which is great. So it's recipients only email. And it means that anyone who wasn't, even if they somehow got the join link because they couldn't get the email, even if they weren't on they'd wait in the meeting lobby even if they somehow got the join link. So again, making it so it really is a recipients only meeting is one of the other parts of this. Plus, block copying on chat. That's the other thing we do and we manage to as well. And we're doing more. Like as watermarking is kicking in, we're going to do watermarking on certain meeting types too for backgrounds. So again, things we're doing to manage ourselves so we don't have to be as afraid of meeting recordings. Because here's the thing, that there's so much value. One of the things we found with Copilot, at least internally, is one of the number one scenarios that we see employees use is just ask questions about meetings. I can jump in a meeting halfway through, ask about a bunch of questions, and get caught up in minutes and go, okay, this person has this concern, here's where we are. I know it because Copilot told me where I ask what are the open concerns, what questions are still open. I can understand where can I jump in on the call. Just halfway through without having to spend a whole bunch of time catching up. So it's a massive time saver, but it works great if a meeting is recorded and transcribed. So Copilot has a full thing to reason over in meeting and after meeting. Because again, after meeting, I've got the ability to ask questions if I couldn't attend at all. But it requires that recording be there, which is one of the reasons why, for me, turning on meeting recording is a big deal, which is why I wanted to make sure I talked about this so much, because it is massive value. It is, and here's the thing that I talked to my friends in legal about this one, and my retention in litigation team, and they're like, there's a risk to the recording. Let's be clear, right? You have something that's there, but it's effectively discoverable, right? So as a company, I have one more thing. It's like an email or a file. It is a discoverable thing. How long you keep it is an important thing, but make sure employees are aware of, yes, don't say something stupid in a meeting you wouldn't put in writing, right? Why would you do that anyways? It's a business context. So in part two, if it really must be off the record, then yeah, don't record. Maybe use Copilot only mode to not have anything post-meeting. But point is, we find that it's really important to allow it, but we've gone through that legal conversation to say, yes, we can make this work. The risk is worth it because employees are doing other things. And here's the thing is IT. Employees are going to take the simplest possible path. You want the good path, a happy path to be IT safe path, right? And so I really want to let my employees do the right thing. I don't want them using other services to work around. I want them recording in place. They can use Copilot, and they don't have to copy paste out and take it to some external consumer service to figure things out. Lastly, app governance. And this is again a hot topic because you want to trust your ISVs, you want to trust your partners, you want to trust your internal developers. But there is a burden there in that I've got a lot of data. When I mentioned earlier, I've got email, I've got files that are highly confidential. I know they're highly confidential, but I'm going to trust some third party or some line of business with that data. When am I going to trust? Well, I'm not going to let just employees choose. I'm going to make some choices as a company. And it might surprise people, but even with Microsoft, we turn off our third-party catalogs and Teams, like in all the other assets, or Teams Enhanced now, what's called, for basically the new catalogs are coming into Outlook and all the other places. So employees can't just, by default, install a third-party app, even if it's in the catalog. And I know that seems weird, but Microsoft would say, yeah, here's a great third-party ecosystem, use it, at the same time, turn it off. But we make it really easy for the employee to get it. Maybe not as easy as it could be, but we make it easier. In that, first of all, every app should be certified. If you want to use it in My Tenant, it needs to be a certified app. And we've got a good process for that. We used to say the third party would have to get certified by our security team, and they'd have to do a whole bunch of work for our security team. And we realized, one, that doesn't help anybody else. Why are we going through a security review for an app and not sharing what the true state is for everybody? And two, our security team doesn't re-audit all the time. And of course, if the landscape changes, we want to re-audit. So one of the things we do here is every third-party app touching the Microsoft tenant is going to be Microsoft 365 certified. If it's not, we're not going to let it in. And that's just a rule now that we have. And so if you're an ISV, I encourage you to get certified. And for everybody else, I would say, look, it is a way to trust that this app has additional level of vetting. And yes, even Microsoft is now willing to trust their own tenant data with a certified app. And if it's certified, it's going to remain certified, because if it loses certification, we will catch it and remove it. But point is, we have a whole certification flow for that. I also have a flow for line of business applications, because clearly we've got a lot of developers at Microsoft who build things, and not just public things, but internal applications, sales applications, HR applications. And those apps, they want access to data. They want to show up in Teams. They want to show up as a Copilot plugin. They want to show up in Outlook. And I need to make sure that those applications are safe. So I have an ingestion flow that basically says all these apps, all these Teams apps, go through a process to get reviewed and effectively approved by us. And the hard part of IT is how do you delegate the security reviews? How do you decide who can do it? And so we've got a process in place to determine that some security team has signed off on this application, some privacy team has signed off on this application. If so, we will then take it through the next steps and decide how to approve it. We will also generally not publish a line of business app, all company. Generally speaking, there's so many that come through. We will do security group targeting for these apps to say only people in this, like LinkedIn, this app, this third-party app or this line of business app is only available for LinkedIn, or this only HR employees. So we will target applications, and we do that either by security groups or, as I mentioned earlier, via 365 groups. In either case, using group membership management, for example, to manage who can be in that group of people who uses the app. Therefore, like everyone in the division, for example. And the last thing that is kind of surprising to some is that I turn off graph consent too. So if an employee visits some site that asks for graph consent or tries to use some app that wants consent to get your data, we have that all turned off. User delegate consent is not available internally. So there's a process flow now that you've got to go through internally. You want either a line of business app to get consent or a third-party app to get consent. It's going to go through that process flow, because again, if something is going to have mail.read or groups.read or sites.full control or any of the other consents, those things are all going to be gated to say, you know what, you're asking for sensitive data, I'm going to deal with you properly. In some cases, what we're going to do, by the way, is we're going to limit that data. I have application comes to us and they say, I want group.read. I don't know how many people know this, but group.read can access group files, can access group email, can access group Teams chats, conversations, in the channel. It can access everything in a group. And so we then ask the question, why do you want group.read? And normally they come back with, I just want to get the membership of a group. It's like, well, then you don't need that consent. Go after group membership.read. And so part of this is having a process flow internally, at least, to make sure the dev team is going to get the least viable consent to get their job done, because I do not want overly broad consents available. Another one is, and now that SharePoint and Exchange both support resource consents, I can say site.selected and say, this app is only going to have access to this SharePoint site. And so I can lock it in with a graph now. And we govern that way too. So every consent, every third party and line of business application, we're going to try to get the minimum viable consent. And in cases where we can, we're going to get to resource-specific consent. One of the cool things Teams has done now too is to have resource consent tied to label. So I can say, this application is allowed to touch only general teams, not confidential or highly confidential. And so again, as opposed to site.selected, where it's consent to a specific thing, I'm consenting to a type of thing, which actually gives us a lot more confidence that, you know what, this app is okay, but I'm not ready to trust my highly confidential data yet. So those are all things that we do in this broad data state to manage ourselves. I won't go into this slide too much because I talked about this the other day, but point is, this is a fair summary of all the things stated ready for Copilot. And I think it summarizes some of the things I talked about here too. Everything from enable self-service, because if it's off your tenant, well, then you're going to have to use a graph or plug in to connect to it. I want to make sure my label schema makes sense. I want to make sure I can have a good trust but verify model. Are people labeling correctly? I want to label all containers. Most containers then should item defaults. I want to do that verify of, do we have any issues here? I want to have good lifecycle management of a tenant because I want to keep things clean. And I want to make sure that I understand the data state. And that's probably one of the harder ones, to be fair, but it's also a really important one because now I really understand and can govern really my tenant. Otherwise, I feel like I'm flying blind, and I do not like that. I don't see it well enough as it is. I don't want my tenant to be blind too. So that's kind of how we think about things overall. So, when I kind of sum up, employees take the easy path, and so when we're governing a tenant, we want the easy path to be the IT approved path. And so we think very carefully about how do we balance, if we make things too hard on the employee, like say, for example, I make it hard for the employee to share from their OneDrive, or then what are they going to do? Well, they're going to share by some other way. Employees are going to get their job done. Are they going to resort to email? Do I block in certain scenarios there? There are things to think about, but I really want to make sure that the pathway the employee can take is well thought and managed because it becomes that really important thing about this. And of course, education. I think I can't talk about that enough. I govern a tenant and I'm focused on the technology, but one of the realization is my partners in the organization have to educate employees as to how to use it, how to get it right, how to label right, and how to use things correctly. Because I'll even take in the meetings case. I should have said this earlier in meetings, but do you really want to take a highly confidential call in a public location? If you do, you better not talk. So that can be that kind of basic expectation of, look, labels matter and having visibility to it matters, which is why we do all these things. So again, meaningful classification schema. So we've got a lot. The funny thing is, as Microsoft's internal customer of ourselves, we learn a lot and we make mistakes. We make lots of mistakes. I got to be quite transparent about that. We made mistakes with labeling before. We made mistakes with some aspects of governance. We make mistakes before we have graph consent available previously in some cases. We made pretty much every mistake in the book. And so we try to learn because, to be fair, we're in an interesting position of trying to dog food our own stuff, be customer zero of ourselves effectively, and at the same time help our products get it right, get us get it right. So we try to share where we can a lot of this stuff. We have new guidance now on how we deployed Copilot, what are all the things around that. There's a Copilot adoption guide. There's guides around how to do meetings and meeting labels and meeting templates and all the things that how we think about this is how we govern these aspects. There's a lot more of it we don't have that I wish we could. We will continue to publish and update collateral, but there's just a lot here available. And again, these links are going to be available. The slide deck is going to be available for everyone after the session. And there's a simple link here to Inside Track to see a summary of all this stuff. Plus, there's a good How Microsoft Does IT hub where you can find all this simply linked in the core. It ties back to the adoption guide on adoption.microsoft.com, because we want to help you drive your own adoption internally. And those are all things I think that hopefully you can learn from us, and I wish we could share more. But like you, our day job is to run the business of our own company, and it makes it really hard we try to share, but at the same time, we've got to run first. So that's kind of where we are. So I hope this was valuable, and please give feedback. But let's start with questions. And I know Claire is running around with Mike. Hold up your hand if you have a question, because I know I covered so many topics. I wish I could have had time in doing it, but I have time for questions now. So,
Teams recording, you touched on how sensitive it is. One of the challenges we have right now is the first question legal is asking is who is using it. So we've turned it on kind of as a preview and quickly found out there is no reporting on Teams recording. So have you guys found a way to do it? Because the product team doesn't have it. So I'm sure you face the same challenge.
Well, one of the nice things with recordings is, of course, there's now files in OneDrive and SharePoint. So they're iterable from your data estate. You can see where exactly your video is in your data estate. And I can tell, here's what exists. And by the way, the recording event is in the audit log. I agree with you on how do you extract that easily? It's there, it's pullable, but not easily reportable. But that said, because these recordings are in OneDrive, I can pull them out that way and understand how much do I have. And the other aspect of this was, I learned the hard way just how much recording was happening because I flooded the service. Like when I was on Stream Classic, it was really bad. I just flooded that service because I had no expiration in place at the time. It was a huge mistake. And yes, reporting for us was a challenge, and I didn't have visibility. I do now, at least on the SharePoint side.
Hi, my question is regarding information lifecycle management, and you kind of touched on it, but outside of the sensitivity labels, are you relying on those data owners to tell you where the HR data is, or where are you using Copilot to tell you? Because I have a pretty large record schedule and a lot of different retention requirements, and it's very difficult sometimes. The labels don't tell me exactly.
Yeah, and I think the retention conversation, I didn't get into that here, and that's a great conversation just by itself, and probably a whole session by itself. I think the key thing there is our legal department likes to basically partner businesses directly and have central, because they used to use record centers back in the day. Now we're using Purview and retention labels in place on sites and teams. But they want that consolidated. So there'll be a contracts library and a partner with a contracts team and make sure there are workflows for that. The HR teams have very specific libraries for things. So it's more of a known quantity, and businesses are educated that, look, when you want to do something, it's going to be a hard retention. Here's what the retention policies are. There's like 60-something retention policies at Microsoft. Employees aren't expected to know that. But point is, the business will work with legal to have more central locations for that stuff. Because most cases, you're right, it's hard to do. Purview can basically do detection and help you find with patterns, but that's not perfect. And our legal department doesn't like what they'll say is not in place record. They don't like in place records, is what I'd say. They like it to be centralized. And that makes it easier for legal to be able to deal with it. And so legal wants it that way. That's why we work with them on that. That's how we do it.
Going back to the meeting recording, so I'm going through that right now with my legal team. How do you stop the MP4 file from the OneDrive location from being sent out of the organization without blocking all MP4 files? So
one of the nice things is you can configure block download on all the meeting recordings on the tenant, other than Meeting Organizer. Like you can't today block Meeting Organizer, although I think there's a setting for that now coming, that you can even block Organizer from download. But point is, that's how we deal with that, is no other attendee can just download the file. And when someone shares that video out, they're sharing a link that is basically read-only copy. In other words, again, no download. And lots more is coming. So just to be clear, I'm not, this is a good story. It's not the perfect story. The perfect story is still coming. A good story is there now, though, because I can block download on videos other than Organizer. How do I even deal with that? More is coming in that space. Yeah, and I can't stop that. If the organizer chooses to share, then it's the organizer's choice to share. Because here's the thing, at some point, I have to have some trust in my employees to do the right thing. But again, everything is audited. So our security operations center knows everything anybody ever does, right? So if an employee does send in that recording out and there's an issue because of it, we know exactly who did what. So I'm going to hold you accountable to as an employee. And we're pretty clear about that, by the way. You're touching the Microsoft tenant. Everything you do is audited. There's no exceptions to that. So be aware, if this is a workplace setting, be aware you're under scrutiny, right? And I think that's one of the ways we can deal with this situation. Because to your point, I would love to block that emailing out of a document by the owner. But if you're talking to the organizer, I can't stop the organizer from doing something stupid. They could download the file, they could email the file, they can put the file in another place. Now, in some cases, it's completely fine. Maybe it's a webinar, but they recorded it on their OneDrive, and now they want to put it on some SharePoint site. And that might be totally fine, but again, like, this is going to get better, I guess is how I'd answer. But today, at least I can keep it to organizer where I now have a little bit of a trust model.
Does your legal require a hold process for the recordings, and how do you facilitate that?
One of the nice things, of course, of Purview is you can reason over a transcript. So if you say, I want to find all content of this subject, for example, or meetings with these themes, I can scoop them up via effectively either DLP or retention policies to find that data against a tenant, to be able to do things like that. One of the things that we're talking about doing in some cases is applying a retention policy to meetings in addition to the expiration. So today, I do that 90-day expiration. I will probably also add some additional hard retention. So you can extend the expiration to 1 year from the 90 days. After a year, I'm going to whack it no matter what, right? Unless, and I'm going to basically say, you want to keep it longer than a year, get it out of your OneDrive, go move it to a SharePoint site for this purpose, right? For training, for example. That's how we're going to handle that. But yeah, we're not putting videos under specific retention out today outside of when someone's on legal hold. Like if someone's on legal hold, like let's say an exec's on legal hold, their OneDrive will be on hold. That video is therefore on hold, just like everything else in their OneDrive.
So we saw that in the slides that might be 7 or 8 labels for meetings. So it's quite a lot. But my question is like, how did you make sure that all the users can implement the labels correctly according to different time or different situation? Like how the user training or adoption goes? That
is an excellent question, and I should have covered that more. But my Tuesday session, I actually did talk about training on labeling a little bit, because that is an important aspect of this. But cultural awareness is really important, how to get it right. And by the way, there's only 5 top-level labels here, and yes, there are sub-labels in many of these cases. But really, there's 5 core choices. Now, I can get more refined and say recipients only or anyone, for example, in the highly confidential or confidential. But so we're trying to keep it simple. That's why there's not too many. It looks like there's a lot of rows here. But if this was a tree structure, the way it kind of shows up, it's kind of a little more simple. And back to the training, video labeling is fairly new for us. So we're doing training now. In fact, we've got training scheduled in June that we're working on right now on how employees should be labeling meetings correctly. We've got security training rolling out this summer on exactly that subject for meeting labels, because we've already rolled out the basic content on what we call our MS Protect site that says, here's how you label all this stuff, here's how you label meetings, here's all the training. But the next step is mandatory video, where employees are going to have to watch to say, here's how I label my sites, here's how I label my files, here's how I label my meetings. We do that periodically. Now that meetings is part, we're updating that training. So this June or July, every employee is going to have to take that training. And if you don't take the training, well, your manager's going to get you, right? It's become mandatory training.
If you don't have the answer to this question, that's fine. But how does your department handle when there's a retention policy on a specific, on a set of documents, and let's say tomorrow that document's due to be deleted? All of this time for the last 5 years or whatever, you've been backing that file up as well. Does your department go into the backups and delete those as well? Or what's your strategy?
That is an excellent question. So the thing about retention and the deletion policy, and specifically retiring the backups, I today do not use the backup service from SharePoint. One of the nice things I have from SharePoint OneDrive is I, of course, have a 93-day recovery. I have the versioning in place. I do not have a backup to worry about. I have a fact that an employee deletes the file, it stays effectively around that way, or a retention deletes the file, it stays around that way. But I don't have a backup problem today. That is actually something we're actively in conversation about. How do we deal with a backup scenario? Because it is one of those things that we need a better story for longer term. But quite frankly, what I found is I do quite well with the in-product disaster recovery in place. Like one of the things that actually we've literally had our tenant fell over to another data center. I've watched it happen. 15 minutes later, we're running live again. It's like everything's read-only for 15 minutes, then we're in another data center. Last time this happened, I know it's even gotten better since, and that we can fail over and recover. So I haven't had to resort to backups for my tenant. So I hope this was valuable anyways. Please give feedback.